Arthur Hayes stood at his window, his rough palms resting on the sill as he watched the dusk settle. 45 winters had passed through him, and this one felt the longest yet. His beard was going white at the chin, and his shoulders carried a grief that had a physical weight. 3 years ago, he'd buried his wife, Clara, beneath a cottonwood tree that bent toward the creek. Since then, Arthur had lived in silence, not because he couldn't speak, but because there was no one worth speaking to. The cabin bore the shape of her memory. Her woven shawl still hung on the back of a chair he never sat in. A shelf of dried herbs gathered dust. He still slept on one side of the bed, though the other had long gone cold. There had been a child once, too, a daughter who'd never taken her first breath. After that, Arthur stopped building cradles. He built fences, mended saddles, and kept to himself. The town whispered about the quiet man who rode in once a month for supplies and spoke only when coin changed hands. That night, as the sky bruised into nightfall, he heard a sound not belonging to the wind. Faint, halting. He thought it might be a coyote, but as he stepped out, shotgun in hand more from habit than threat, he saw her. She lay in the snow beneath the cedar by the barn, curled inward like the wind had carved her hollow. Her dress, made of a fine silk he'd never seen in these parts, was torn at the sleeve, and blood soaked the fabric from shoulder to wrist. She was barefoot, young, and still as the deer he used to hunt in lean years. For a long moment, Arthur simply looked at her, the way a man stares at something he cannot believe is real. Then he lowered the gun. He didn't ask who she was or where she came from. He just lifted her with careful arms, as if afraid she might fall apart. She weighed less than sorrow and carried the scent of river water and smoke. When he crossed the threshold of the cabin, it felt like bringing a storm inside. He laid her near the hearth and wrapped her in the only blanket not steeped in memory. She stirred faintly, her lips dry and cracked, murmuring in a language he didn't speak but felt in his bones. The dialect of the Chinese workers who had laid the railroad tracks years ago. This girl, no more than 20, had the look of someone running from more than hard labor. He poured a basin of warm water and gently washed the blood from her skin. There was a deep gash on her arm, but the wound was clean. He stitched it with the quiet skill of a man who had done this for a living, before the war, before the farm, before everything. She watched him through half-lidded eyes, flinching only once when the needle met flesh. When he finished, he stepped outside and let the cold wind clear the weight from his lungs. The moon was rising, casting long shadows on the prairie. Inside, the girl had curled closer to the fire, asleep. Her breathing was shallow but steady. He told himself she'd be gone by morning. But morning came, and she remained. She woke before the sun, sitting upright with a sharpness born of fear. Arthur had left a piece of cornbread and some jerky on a plate beside her. She reached for it like a trapped animal, quick and cautious. He sat at the table drinking coffee, not watching her, but not ignoring her either. When her eyes met his, there was no demand, no plea, no gratitude. Just an uneasy truce between strangers. "You're safe here," he said, his voice rough from disuse. For now she didn't answer, but she didn't run. The snow thickened that day. When Arthur returned from tending the livestock, she had swept the hearth clean and folded the blanket. He made a simple stew that night. She ate slowly, her movements precise. He noticed how she chewed on only one side of her mouth and suspected a bruise hidden beneath her dark hair. That night, the storm worsened. The wind howled. Arthur gave her the bed and slept in his chair by the fire. It was not a kindness, he told himself. Just practicality. In the middle of the night, he woke to find her standing at the window, her silhouette sharp against the firelight, scanning the horizon. He rose slowly. "You expecting trouble?" She turned, and for the first time, she really looked at him. After a long, fragile silence, she nodded once. Arthur had known trouble in many forms: war, hunger, loss. But this felt different. This was not his trouble, yet somehow it had already made its home in his life. He crossed the room and pulled a blanket from a chair. "We'll figure it out come morning." She looked at him with something unreadable. Not trust, not yet, but not fear either. As the wind beat against the walls, something in him shifted. The silence no longer felt only like morning. When dawn bled through the shutters, pink and pale, Arthur stepped outside to feed the horses. His breath caught. Hoofprints, dozens of them, circled the cabin like a noose. He looked to the ridge and saw them. Riders, 100 men, maybe more. They were not warriors with painted faces, but grim-faced men in dark clothing, their silence an organized threat. At their head sat a man, tall in his saddle, his fine silk cloak whipping in the wind. Arthur's chest tightened, not with fear but with a cold clarity. He turned slowly back to the house. Inside, the girl stood near the fire, her eyes wide, but not surprised. And in that stillness, a quiet understanding passed between them. He neither was safe, but neither would run. Not anymore. The morning air was brittle with cold. Arthur stood outside, one hand on the fence rail, watching as the riders crested the low ridge like a wave of earth and motion. Their approach was deliberate, not a charge, but a claim. At their head was a man draped in a dark, embroidered silk cloak. His expression was unreadable, carved from old stone and authority. He stopped a dozen yards from the cabin, and the others formed a wide, silent ring behind him, surrounding the house without raising a single weapon. The girl stepped forward before Arthur could speak. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. "Father," she said. The man on the horse said nothing. His gaze passed over her, then landed on Arthur. Arthur remained still, arms loose at his sides. He only watched, trying to understand what this man saw, a broken-spirited rancher with a cabin full of ghosts, standing next to his daughter. The silence stretched until the wind returned, brushing along the edges of the gathering. Then the father spoke, his voice a low, solemn rumble. "You sheltered her, it wasn't a question." Arthur gave a slow nod. The leader dismounted, snow creaking beneath his boots. He walked forward with calm authority, stopping only a few paces from Arthur, close enough to strike. The girl stepped between them. "I chose not to return," she said quietly, but with unshakable certainty. The father's eyes, dark and ancient, flicked toward his daughter, then back to Arthur. "She ran from an arrangement that would have secured our family's honor. You interfered." "I didn't give her anything," Arthur answered, his voice steady. "She took it back herself." The girl's father studied him for a long moment, a flicker of something, not softness, but recalibration, in his eyes. He was taking the measure of the man before him. "I did not run from you," she told her father. "I ran from men who saw me as property." The leader looked away, toward the open prairie behind Arthur's homestead. The past stretched out there, tangled with blood, bargains, and sorrow. He turned back to Arthur. "My men will not strike today." Relief, subtle and swift, passed through the girl's shoulders, but Arthur didn't relax. He heard the unsaid part. "But they may return," the father continued. "You have 3 days. Then I come not as a father, but to collect what is mine." He mounted again in a fluid movement. The circle of men turned with him, their horses moving like tidewater pulled by an unseen moon. Within minutes they were gone, leaving only churned snow and the thud of retreating hooves behind. Inside, the cabin had grown cold. "You should go with them," Arthur said, not unkindly. She looked up. "And go where?" "Back to silence? Back to marrying a man who sees me only as a name on a contract." She added softly, "You gave me a room that didn't lock." That was enough. He busied himself with the fire, unable to look at her too long without feeling something shift beneath his skin. 3 days. He counted them like grains in an hourglass. Later that evening, as the wind howled, she sat across the room, weaving a strip of leather into something new. He watched her from the corner of his eye, not with desire, but with wonder. She caught him watching. "You don't fear them," she said. "No. I've already lost what most men fear to lose." She nodded slowly. "I have not. But I came close." The fire snapped. "I won't ask you to keep me," she said, her voice low. "But I won't leave unless you make me." He looked at her then, really looked. She wasn't soft in the way Clara had been. She didn't carry lightness or easy laughter. She carried storm, silence, and the stubborn root of something growing in scorched ground. He didn't tell her to leave. He just stood and stoked the fire again. Outside, the tracks of 100 horses remained etched into the snow. A warning, a promise. And somewhere in Arthur's chest, something long dormant began to stir. The next 2 days passed in a muted quiet. The brittle edge of winter momentarily dulled. Arthur busied himself with chores, his mind heavy with the leader's words. The girl, whose name he still didn't know, moved through the cabin like a ghost turned tangible. She swept the hearth, cleaned his tin plates, and refilled the woodpile without being asked. The silence between them had changed, it was no longer a wall but a room they both stood inside. She asked for his wife's name. Clara, he said, quiet as snow falling. Later, he noticed she'd placed the old shawl Clara used to wear neatly folded at the foot of the bed, taking another for herself. One evening, he returned from town with supplies. Mrs. Gable, the storekeep, had eyed him strangely when he bought fabric and tea. "You've got company, Arthur?" she'd asked, her tone sharp. "Someone passing through," he'd replied. Mrs. Gable squinted. "One of them railroad girls?" Company's not always good company. Arthur had paid and left without another word. That night, he laid the blue cotton fabric on the table. The girl touched it with a faint brush of her fingers, her expression holding something close to gratitude. As dusk bruised the sky on the second day, they shared a meal that felt like communion rather than survival. Afterward, he stood by the hearth, and she stood behind him, not touching, but there. "You remind me of my mother," she said. "You listen the way she did." Like every silence is a sentence you're still learning to read. He didn't know what to do with that, so he said what he could. "You're not what I expected, neither are you," she replied. The next day, the time had narrowed. He found her standing by the cedar tree, hand on its trunk, eyes closed, like someone saying goodbye. "You think they'll take you?" he asked when she came inside. "They'll try. I could leave. Ride with you, get you past the ridge." She shook her head. "You run, they'll chase harder. They'll think you took me. That it was about conquest, not choice." His jaw clenched. "And if I tell them otherwise? They won't believe you." Not at first. She looked at him, her eyes dark and fierce. "You're not one of them. I'm not one of you." A pause. "Maybe we're the language between." That night, they sat close by the fire. He told her, finally, about his daughter, about the tiny, unnamed grave beneath the cartonwood. She took his hand, her fingers warmer and stronger than Clara's had been. "I think she lived," she said. "Even if only in your dreams. The air was too full for sleep, too thick with waiting." In the dark, he whispered, "What's your name?" "My." He tasted the name, let it settle on his tongue. "My." She breathed in, as if she hadn't heard it said like that in years. Outside, the wind shifted, and the final morning waited just beyond the edge of sleep. The morning broke without color, under a sky stretched thin with ash and wind. The land felt like a drum skin stretched too tight. The riders would return today. Inside, Mai braided her hair back tightly. She dressed not as a girl waiting to be rescued, but as someone bracing for what would come. Arthur made coffee, though his hand shook just enough to spill a few drops. They sat at the table, memorizing the stillness before it vanished. "They will want me to return," she said. "They see me as belonging to them." "You don't," Arthur said softly. "Belong to anyone." Her eyes met his. "That is not how they see it. A woman sheltered is a woman claimed. They will not ask why you help me. They will assume they already know. Then we tell them. They may not listen. Then we make them," he said, a resolve forged from sorrow hardening his voice. She reached across the table and placed her fingers over his. By noon, the first rumble didn't come from the sky. It came from the earth. The hooves were returning. They came in a tight line this time, a wall of riders in dark suits and silence. At their center was Mai's father, his expression drawn. Mai stepped outside and stood beside Arthur, her eyes steady, her spine straight. Her father, Liang, raised a hand, and his men dismounted. Still no weapons were drawn, but the weight of intention hung as thick as the storm clouds above. "You have had your days," Liang said. "Now she returns." "She is not property," Arthur replied. "She is my daughter," Liang answered. "That is not ownership. That is a bond. And when a bond is broken, something dies." Mai took a step forward. "Then let it die, if it was built on silence." A murmur ran through the men. Liang's jaw tensed. He approached her, his eyes burning. "You would stay with this man, who does not know our ways, who will never walk the path you were born to." "I would stay with a man who let me be," she said. "Who saw me before he needed me to be anything." Liang's eyes turned to Arthur. "You love her." The word settled in the space between wind and silence. Arthur looked at Mai, then back at her father. "I lost everything I loved. I wouldn't ask her to stay unless she chose to." Liang considered this, his face impassive. Then slowly, he reached into his coat and produced a heavy purse, its leather worn smooth. He stepped forward and held it out to Arthur. "This will set you up for life. Far from here. Leave her. A man does not win a daughter, he shows his price." Arthur looked at the purse, then back at Liang's unyielding face. He didn't reach for it. He didn't even glance at the wealth it promised. "Her choice isn't for sale," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "And neither is my honor." The air shifted. Liang stared at him, then at his daughter, who stood unwavering. For the first time, the stone of his expression seemed to crack. He could not force her, not without breaking her completely. He pulled the purse back. "The path you choose is not the one I made for you," he said to Mai, his voice laced with a cold sorrow. "Do not expect me to clear the stones from it." He turned without another word and walked to his horse. The men mounted. No battle came. No blood spilled. Just departure, and the first drops of a cleansing rain. When the sound of hooves faded, Arthur and Mai stood alone in the quiet. The storm did not howl, it wept. They entered the cabin and shed their wet coats. The fire hissed, but its warmth held steady. She approached him slowly, her eyes raw. "You didn't flinch. Didn't know I had the choice. I was ready to leave. I would have let you." She stepped closer, and he let her. There was no trembling now, no breath held back. "I want to stay," she said. He reached out and touched her cheek. Her skin was damp from the rain, but warm. "Then stay," he said, as if there was nothing in the world more simple or more sacred. The rain hit the roof like a lullaby, and her fingers found his, not in urgency, but in quiet trust. They didn't speak of forever. They spoke only in touches, in glances, in breaths shared as the storm clouds drifted away. Outside, the tracks of the horses filled slowly with water, and the two people who had been lost, not from the world but from themselves, began to root again together in soil softened by rain. In the days that followed, a new rhythm took hold. They rode to town side by side. At Mrs. Gable's store, the hush was immediate. "Well," the storekeeper said, arms crossed. "You brought her back then?" "She's not cargo," Arthur said, meeting her stare. Mai stepped forward, her voice calm but clear. "I am not an arrangement. I am a woman who chose." The words hung in the dusty air. Before they left, Arthur looked at Mrs. Gable and the silent onlookers. "We'll be married come spring." A murmur ran through the room, but Mai didn't flinch. She simply turned and walked out, leaving the storm of judgment to settle in their wake. They rode home slow, the sun lowering behind them in gold and rust. That night, the fire burned low and rich. "Will you miss them?" he asked. "Your people?" She thought for a moment. "I miss who I was before they told me what I had to be." Arthur stared into the fire. "I know that feeling." She crossed to him and placed her hands on either side of his face. "You never told me what you wanted." He looked up at her, his eyes lined but steady. I wanted peace. I didn't know what that meant until you walked through my door. She kissed him then, a kiss that settled into him, anchoring something that had floated for too long. One evening, weeks later, Arthur sat by the fire with a half-finished cradle in his lap. He carved it slowly, carefully, the way he once had for a child who never opened her eyes. This one was different. This one was for the life blooming in the curve of Mai's belly. She leaned against the doorway, watching him, her hands cradling herself like a prayer already answered. "You're different," she said. He looked up. "How so?" "Lighter. Like your shadow doesn't cling so hard anymore." He chuckled softly. "Might be because I don't carry it alone outside." The stars spilled across the prairie sky. The fire crackled, the baby kicked, the man carved, and the woman stood unbroken, beloved, chosen. "Some stories begin with fire," Arthur whispered into the stillness. "Some with ash. Ours began the moment I opened that door." Mai crossed to him, placed her hand over his heart, and whispered back, "And I walked in."